Let's open up the Vintage Collection 3.75-inch figure of Vel Sartha from Andor Season 1. Varykino. If it's Star Wars, we collect it. Hello there, thanks for visiting Varykino. After a recent rewatch of the fantastic Andor Series 1, it really made me reflect on the amount of action figures I have on display in both Black Series and Vintage Collection. Now, because space is always at a premium as a Star Wars action figure collector, and I like to display my figures clustered by film and series, I generally wait until I've got a few on hand before I finally undergo that task of shuffling everything around to make space for my new figures. And so I had waited to see how many Hasbro would release before undertaking that task, and I'm kind of done waiting. There haven't been as many as I wanted, and I really do want to get my figures on display because I love the Andor series. So I recently opened up my Black Series Andor figures, and now I'm making my way through the ones that I have in the Vintage Collection line, like Vel Sartha here. The Andor figures in particular have been quite hard to find here in New Zealand, so I'm really looking forward to opening them up and taking a closer look. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Coming up really soon, I'll take a closer look at Vel Sartha and her accessories out of the packaging. But first, let's take one last look at the backing card. The backing card for the Vintage Collection line of action figures is largely inspired by the classic Kenner backing card style from the original vintage Star Wars action figures of the 1970s and 80s. We have the Star Wars logo here with a ring around the Andor logo, which is really fun. I like the kind of stencil style, and of course we have the Andor style rebellion symbol here, of course, as the O in the logo there. We have a single chrome racetrack design surrounding the character art here on the side, which is a nice clear promotional shot of Vel Sartha from the show. I like it when Hasbro was able to get a hold of and use high-res promotional pictures. They just look a little bit sharper and a little bit more sort of better positioned on the backing card rather than sort of like a screen grab of a character. I know sometimes they have to use what they can get, but I really like the way this one looks here. For Vel Sartha, we have a lovely yellow accent color here. For the title plate, Vel Sartha there in black font, and of course also behind the figure. Now, she does only come with one accessory. She has a blaster rifle there, so we do see a little bit of space around the figure because she is a shorter character. She doesn't kind of fill up the bubble quite as much, but personally I do like that the Vintage Collection line uses very standardized bubble sizes. That's one aspect I like over some of the older backing card styles that Hasbro has experimented with over the years. Moving on to the back, now this one is VC262, which is a little bit ago. I've had this one stored away for a while, so we do have the slightly older backing card style for the back here, which again is inspired by the original Kenner action figures. We have a black background here with the Star Wars logo and a twin chrome racetrack design surrounding some artwork of other action figures that were available around the same time there. We can see a Cassian Andor figure, of course, also from Andor there as well. As again, we can see some of the other ones. We've got that fabulous Darth Vader Dark Times figure there as well, and some others from The Mandalorian, as well as Gaming Greats figures. The rest of the packaging, there is a lot of text on the back, unfortunately, of these Vintage Collection cards. I kind of wish they could shrink it down. When I think back to those Kenner figures where we had just a lot of cool pictures on the back, modern action figures have to have a lot of warning and copyright. It takes up a lot of space, and we could do with more cool pictures of Star Wars figures there on the back. And of course, we now have a new, completely different style for Vintage Collection backing card figures. I'm kind of torn on which one I like better. This one's very nostalgic, but there is some really fun imagery on that new style. Of course, we also have the Vintage Collection logo here as well. So overall, a pretty nice card. I like the presentation. I think yellow works really well for this character. I love that Andor logo, and it's a nice high-res promotional image there. But on the whole, I don't have the space to keep all of my Star Wars action figures carded, and I do like to get them out, check out their details, and add them to sort of an in-world display of all of the characters. So it's time to open this one up. So now I have the Vel Sartha 3.75-inch figure and her one blaster rifle accessory out of the packaging, so we can go over all of the details. So of course she does have a slightly simpler costume compared to many other vintage collection figures, but of course that is how she does appear on screen. She does have a few different outfits as we see her in her story arc in the Andor series, but it's interesting that they chose her sort of one that she wears for the actual heist as her first version that they're going to put out in both the Black series and their vintage collection figure lines. So she has dark pants, knee-high boots, and predominantly this brown leather jacket, which, to be honest, does look a little bit more real world. If you were walking down the street wearing an outfit like this, it probably wouldn't turn my head. It looks very much like regular streetwear, with of course the exception of a large blaster rifle, of course. But let's go over the details. There are some that I think are interestingly different than how Hasbro did it on the Black Series figure, and I'll mention those when I get to them. So I'm going to start off with her face here. So I do think that this one doesn't look exactly like the actress. For some figures, Hasbro just gets an absolute spot-on likeness to the point where when I'm looking at the characters, I can hear their voices. I can sort of feel those sort of scenes coming to life when I look at the faces. And while I think this is a pretty sculpt here, it doesn't feel like a exact true likeness of the actress that played Vel Sartha. There's just something about it that's just a little bit, I don't know. And I know that sometimes there are actors where they just, it takes Hasbro a long time to kind of really get that likeness sort of coming through in action figures. And I think Vel Sartha is unfortunately one of that group there as well. She's got a tidy face sculpt, and of course we've got that fantastic digital printing for her eyes there. And she has her blonde hair pulled back into a high ponytail. So her hairstyle actually has a number of braids in it. And we can just kind of see that there is a very small braid as part of the sculpting here for this ponytail. You can just see it tucked in there. Now on the Black series, there was also a little braid that was kind of coming out of the ponytail that was actually separate. It was a flexible piece of plastic that sort of laid over her shoulder, and you could kind of move it around. For this one, you can see that they've actually chosen to sculpt it again with the hair of the ponytail just tucked in there. Very, very small. It is not a separate piece, which I do understand the scale of braids on the 3.75 inch is going to be so much smaller compared to the 6 inch. And the third braid is done exactly like the Black series, where it just kind of tucks out and extends below the hair in the back. So that's what this little part here is. It's sort of the third braid. You can just see that we've got a little bit of flex here with this hair. I can move that around. And of course, like most sort of ponytail and long hair pieces in this line, you can see that this one is sculpted separately and sort of attached here where the ponytail is sort of drawn together there. So because I can flex that bottom part here, I'm expecting the hair to have a little bit of a flex. This bottom part wiggles a lot because it's very thin and small, but there is just a little bit of flex to the rest of it. But I'm probably not going to really stress that because I don't want to pop it out. I don't know how securely that is glued in there. We do have a pretty good match here in color because, of course, the hair on the top of her head is sculpted as part of the head. So this part here is painted. And I do like the very, very subtle sort of ombre effect. Many people do have a slightly darker color at the root of the hair. So we have a slightly darker color running along her hairline, which is painted quite nicely here. And then of course we're going lighter, moving towards the ponytail. And the ponytail itself is made out of sort of this yellowy blonde plastic, whereas this is painted. Overall, that is a pretty good match. This part here is just a little bit darker, but that works in sort of the ombre effect. Darker hair traveling through to sort of lighter by the time we sort of get to the ends of hairs, like many people do find. Another little interesting detail that is really small, and I wasn't sure how well this would actually show up in the 3.75 inch line, is she does actually wear a tiny little silver earpiece for the heist, and we can see that that is sculpted and actually painted there in her ear, this very, very tiny tiny little metallic silver dot. It kind of catches the light at some angles. I really like that they even did that on this tiny scale. Of course, it is not present in the other ear there. So overall, pretty nice. I just think the likeness is just somehow a little bit, I think sometimes it's the angles. Sometimes when I'm looking at the figure, when I'm holding it, I'm like, oh yes, that looks like here. And then I sort of look at it straight on and I'm like, it's a little bit not as good. But let's just test out how well that here. Okay, so it does kind of swish over the shoulders there. Of course, we can start to sort of expose the articulation there, but I can move the head around with the hair kind of resting on the shoulder. That's another good point of having the flicks there. We can see that that ponytail's just bending there a little bit there at the ends, at that little braid point there. Not too much front and back. Got a little bit of a rock there. It's not like the hair is really stopping it because it's just floating above there, but we just don't have too much front and back in the 3.75 inch, but pretty smooth side to side as I would hope. So overall, pretty good detail there. This ponytail is attached nicely. I like the color match. Of course, we've got a nice tidy hairline. I do tend to focus on that because I find that if there is a detail around the face, it really throws off the figure. You know, we're drawn to see people's faces. It's just sort of, it's always where human eyes are going to be drawn to. So anything close to the face that isn't painted quite right, and it really throws me off. So hairline, really nice. I like that little detail there in the ear as well. So moving it down to her brown jacket. So I was really curious to sort of feel this one out of the packaging, and I know that sounds a little bit unusual, but I thought it was interesting that this is sculpted and sort of executed in a really different manner to the way that Hasbro did for the Black Series version, despite the fact that they have very similar points of articulation. So in the Black Series figure, she has this mid-torso articulation, like many figures do, but it wasn't visible on the figure, and I thought, oh, have they actually not done that on the Black Series version of the figure? But taking it out of the box, because unfortunately the Vel Sartha Black Series figure came in a plastic-free packaging box with no window, so I couldn't sort of see and sort of observe it through the plastic window. So it was really interesting getting my hands on it for the first time. So the articulation was completely hidden because the torso section of her brown leather jacket was rubbery. And so the articulation was hidden underneath the rubbery jacket. So when I rocked her torso backwards and forwards, the jacket bent with that movement over the articulation point hidden underneath. And I thought that was a really clever way. It kind of made the jacket just a little bit bigger on her body, but I really liked the way that it hid that articulation point. And of course, it moved around the hips as well. So I thought that that was really interesting because I was expecting it, because I couldn't see through the box, to be the same as the vintage collection figure, which I have here, of course, where we do see that articulation line. Now this is, I wanted to check, this is all hard plastic, as it looked through the bubble there, but because it was rubbery on the Black Series figure, I wanted to sort of really feel it, because the rubbery one was so close to the body, it didn't look rubbery until you felt it. So yes, this is a hard plastic on both components. As best I can tell, I don't think this is rubbery around. It doesn't feel like, sometimes the sort of the jacket sections around the torso are just a little bit rubbery. This feels like a hard plastic to me. This feels, the top and bottom part of the jacket feel the same to me. And of course, we've got that articulation line there. Sometimes I do understand that the different scales of the Black Series and vintage collection lines means that Hasbro probably has to do some different techniques to sort of execute the same, you know, costume and details. But I thought it was interesting just to see such a big difference between those two figures. So I do like the sculpting of her jacket here. There's something about the way that it sort of nips in at the waist into the back that's a little bit different to the way that it sits in the front. It's just a little bit more sort of squared off at the front and looks a little bit more nipped in from the back. It's kind of interesting because you'd think it would just look the same front and back, but I like the way that it sort of fits to her body. And of course, we can see the cool jacket details with the collar sort of folded down there a little bit, and we get a little bit of a peek of the shirt sort of that she's wearing underneath there at the collar as well. Nice tidy lines around the neck. I do get distracted if any kind of paint around the neck is sort of on the skin section. You know, that's clearly not supposed to be there, but nice and tidy there as well. And of course, we don't really have too much in the way of paint detail on her jacket. It's another sort of element that leads this to look like, unfortunately, a slightly simpler figure overall, because we don't really have that much in the way of painted details here. We have that little bit of detail there at the collar, and we can see that we have a little bit of an undershirt here. I do think it's interesting that the collar part here has a bit more of a green tone to it than the part that we see here sort of poking out. It's like these are two different paints, and as I would understand it, I would think that these are the same shirt underneath. We can sort of see the collar there and there, but this one definitely looks more green compared to the color of sort of the shirt that's tucking sort of at the bottom here as well. We do have a little bit of a stripe around the sleeve here, a little bit of an accent stripe, which does look like it's the same color as this shirt piece here, and you can see that on that sleeve there as well. But other than that, we don't have sort of rank badges. There is no weathering or anything like that on here. We just have the brown plastic of the sort of what we've made, what Hasbro has used for the figure. It's just sort of what we can see is what it's made of, and sometimes that gives figures a little bit of a flatter appearance, a little bit more of a plastic toy appearance. I do like the texture of the jacket. Hasbro does a pretty good job of giving us different subtle textures, and certainly the way that fabric sits, they do a pretty good job. I like the wrinkles, particularly in the back here, the way that leather jackets kind of crease in the small of the back. I like the way that they have kind of done that. We've also got very faint sort of seam lines and stitching details on the back of the sleeves and things like that. I like the way that it kind of helps bring in detail. Back in the very past, you know, old days, we just have very straight sort of sleeves, very sort of stocky, sort of squared off details. Not all of these little fabric wrinkles like we do in the vintage collection. I love that little attention to detail, but it is just a shame that we don't really have much in the way of costume details to give Hasbro that sort of ability to sort of put in some more painted details. So it just looks a little flat. I think when we get the blaster rifle in her hand, it's going to sort of give a bit more detail to the overall figure. When she's by herself, she kind of just looks like a regular person. She could have walked off, you know, sort of like a Marvel action hero, you know, set or something like that, because she looks a little bit more sort of modern. The one thing that kind of does make her seem a little bit more like a Star Wars character is this kind of little tech piece, sort of bracelet here on her wrist. It kind of reminds me of that kind of calculator watch, the very 80s accessory that Princess Leia wears on Andor with the sort of rebellion, you know, that sort of like, it's sort of dated by modern standards, but you know, it's supposed to look sort of science fiction. And Vel Sartha is wearing something very similar here as well. She has a silver kind of greebly tech little band here. We have a little bit of a black band here, almost like a watch strap, and then we have silver here at the front. This is basically the one sort of detail that really makes this feel like a little bit different than just jacket, pants, and boots. We've just got this one little painted detail here, and it is painted very well. There is some good sculpting detail there. There's even like a little bit of sort of a watch band texture to the back of it. It's really hard to show because it's plain black. I'm trying to see if I can get the camera to focus on it because it's really small. It's just got a little bit of sort of a textured difference to sort of make it stand out from the texture of the jacket there. I might have to put a picture in or two to kind of try and highlight that, because I do appreciate when there are small costume details that Hasbro does paint them well. We can see that she's wearing fingerless gloves, which are painted quite nicely. We can see that they are made in black, because you can kind of tell when fingers are painted a human skin color versus when they are sort of sculpted in a skin color. And this one definitely looks like the fingers are painted. There's just a sort of a gloss finish to them, especially the sort of pointed trigger finger there. But they look pretty tidy. Gonna be really fun to see if I can get some two-handed poses with that blaster rifle accessory, because she's got some pretty good articulation. So I tested her head. Let's test out the torso, because I want to see how well I can sort of get the front and back. She gets some good arch there in the small of her back. not too much forward. She stands up nice and straight when she is tipped all the way forward, but we've got that nice rocking motion there. Now, oh, that's actually really smooth to the side. Of course, she's going to look a little bit odd twisted to the side because this should really be traveling with your torso if it was a real garment, but that's nice. Sometimes with figures, they can kind of go to the side, but it's awkward. It feels like you're grinding something, or they want to snap back to center, but she does actually hold poses to the side nicely, which I like. There's absolutely no fight here. I don't feel like I'm breaking anything or risking anything on the inside. So that is very nice. So as far as I can tell, yeah, there isn't an additional sort of old school waist articulation point here as well. It's just at this sort of mid-torso line there. So that's kind of fun. And of course, she is a female character that does have slender arms. So without the bulk of sort of big armor or anything like that, we shouldn't have much to really get in the way of articulation. When her arms are straight down by her sides, we can see the articulation sort of points there coming through at the shoulders, which are a little bit visible. And of course, we do get this little bit of a cut-in with the sort of torso part of the jacket. It's not quite the perfect match there, but of course we do want to be able to move her arms around. Arms are especially important for any character that's sort of wielding an action accessory, especially something that's two-handed as well. You know, Jedi need to fling their arms around for lightsaber acrobatics, but two-handed poses generally require a little bit of finesse to really get those two hands in the right position to hold on to a weapon. And I like the fact that she's got just absolutely free range of motion. There's nothing that's really getting in the way of the poses that I'm going to want to do with her arms. So that one's just a little bit stiff there, but we should, if I can just sort of do a little bit of a sort of a mime here with her arms. I'm hoping I'll be able to get her into a two-hand position there for a blaster rifle very shortly. So just looking at her hands, this one's actually tipped quite forward. Now, yeah, that's just kind of sculpted like that. It's got a bit more of a lean than other figures that I've come across. And I think that that's how that is actually sort of sculpted. It's not straight out from the wrist like this one is. This one sort of follows that. This one, the sort of, we've got a bit more of an inward lean. That's interesting. And of course we can rotate them as well. I'm hoping we'll get some cool poses there. Really nice and like not loose, but I'm not having to fight. Sometimes figures can be really stiff, especially if they've been in their packaging for a little while. So it sort of feels like you're really sort of creaking the plastic around, but she's nice. This is cool. I'm hoping we're going to get some cool poses from her very shortly. And I like how everything's just moving well on her, which again, I should hope so, because there is no costume details to really get in the way of the articulation and sort of sculpting details. So of course, when we don't have big bulky like stormtrooper armor to sort of hide or perhaps get in the way of articulation, it also means that sometimes in those unfortunate moments, we don't have anything to sort of hide some of those things that look a little bit awkward. And one of those slightly awkward parts for me personally is the sort of the underwear shape that we get when there isn't detail to kind of hide the hip articulation here. And unfortunately we kind of just get this very sort of exaggerated sort of underwear shape here because we just don't have anything to sort of block that, because she is wearing relatively plain black pants here. There are some seam lines that we see in the sculpting running down the front of her legs, but she doesn't even really have big pouches or anything like that. We've just got some sort of, you know, wrinkles and things like that, sort of fabric textures. I like the wrinkles on the back of the knees. Of course, pants are always going to wrinkle at the back there. There is some really good sculpting here, but there's just nothing to really sort of help disguise this section here at the front, which just looks a little bit awkward. I noticed this on the X-Wing pilots as well. Some of them modern and New Hope range of figures that are just stunning. When you get to some of the ones that have the slightly more fitted pants, we still get this slightly awkward shape, which sometimes draws the eye in an unfortunate way. But of course, it means that we should have very good articulation here. So she's just a little bit stiff straight out of the box. Let's see if I can get her. She's gonna raise her leg all the way up. It's just a little bit stiff, actually. Let's see if this one's gonna be, yeah, it's a little bit stiff. it's kind of getting to here and it's kind of wanting to spring back. She's going to need a little bit of a loosen up. She definitely wants to sort of stand up straight a little bit more than she wants to be acrobatic. And of course we can see that we've got those swivel points there quite high on this one, close to the top of the thigh. And these can be sort of really helpful to just get a little bit of a tweak in the legs, especially for some of the slender female characters. I find that sometimes they can be a little bit less steady for posing in a standing up position because they tend to have smaller feet and just a thinner frame in the lower half of the body. So sometimes having those little tweak points there to really just sort of adjust and fine tune their poses. But she does have this central line sculpted running down the front of her pants. So tweaking this sort of a swivel point, it starts to break up that sculpting line, but sometimes you have to sacrifice just that sort of real costume accuracy and sort of alignment just to be able to sort of get the pose that you want. So let's just tip her out to the side. That's nice and easy, just a little bit stiff there going to the front, but she is a blaster rifle wielder. I don't think I'm going to have her sort of running and jumping in quite the same way. Just a little bit sort of stiff, but of course every figure goes together just a little bit different. Sometimes what's tight on mine is going to be loose and easy to pose on another figure from the same run. It's all just sort of the quirk of the plastic. Mine just kind of wants to get to here and it kind of just wants to sort of spring back. It's not really sort of holding itself up there. Just something to note. And of course, I like the modern articulation of knees, particularly because if you tuck long pants into knee-high boots, you kind of get this bunching and gathering, which does a really good job of hiding articulation around the knees. So let's test out her knees. That was really easy. Okay, those are smooth knees. That bent back very easy. We can see that articulation there. And of course, we can swivel those around a little bit. That one's a little bit tight. Sometimes I can swivel them a little bit better. But yeah, that went front and back very easily. Squeaking a little bit, but that's very easy. Almost, yeah, that's got to be one of the freer sort of articulated knees that I've come across in a Star Wars figure recently. Usually they're just a little bit tight, like I've got here at the top. Now she does have some nice boots here. And because sometimes you notice a little bit of a difference in the color on the legs of certain characters. So, you know, Hasbro tries to sort of avoid painting where they don't have to. So the lower half here, these boots are going to be made out of the brown plastic, which means we've got a little bit of leg here just below the knee articulation point that has to be painted. And these leg parts here are going to be made out of plastic that doesn't need to be painted. So this part here is generally have to be painted to match here, but luckily for this figure she's wearing black pants and matching black to black is generally much easier than certain other colors. So this looks really good. Like I don't see any kind of difference there. The actual sort of sheen of these components here, very nice and smooth, looking really nice there, and nice and tidy lines around the top of the boots as well. Sometimes you get a little bit of a overspill one way or the other where we've got brown on the pants where it shouldn't be because they haven't painted it, or sometimes, you know, the black is coming down on the boots where it shouldn't be. Nice tidy definition there. It is a little bit of a shame that we don't have, again, no accent paint here on the boots in terms of like weathering or scuffing or anything like that. You know, they are kind of clean boots, you know, just the complete sort of flat brown, and that may bother some people. You know, Aldhani is a grassy planet, but most of the heist is kind of within the Imperial base, so I kind of see that, you know, maybe it's not muddy, but sometimes just having a little bit of weathering, even if it's just a very light wash, just sort of helps bring out some of the sculpting detail and makes the plastic look less plastic, I find. So we've got some nice buckle details here, especially around the calves. Her boots remind me of sort of a prequel Obi-Wan Kenobi Jedi boots. I always think of any kind of knee-high brown boot that has these buckled straps always remind me of Obi-Wan's boots. But yeah, some really nice sculpting detail there. We can even sort of see where these, if I can just move her leg out of the way, where they would have had zips on the original sort of costume boots, because we can sort of see that line that breaks up those straps, because of course in reality you have to generally zip up tall boots. So I like that there's even that line there on the inside of the leg where there would have, you know, very sensibly been some zips to help the actress get her costume on there. So let's just check out the articulation there at the ankles. That's nice. A little bit tight, but you generally want ankles to not be too floppy because they really do contribute a lot to how well a figure is going to stand up there. So very good articulation, a little bit tight on the hips of mine, but generally speaking, most of my figures, most of them are standing on two legs upright, holding whatever accessory they come with. So because she is a two-handed blaster wielder, my figure is probably going to be standing upright holding her blaster. So I've been playing around with her articulation. I've kind of twisted her ankle a little bit to the side, but she'll probably be on a stand, and even with all of that bending and posing, she stands up reasonably well, which is a good positive for me. I don't like having to sort of, some figures, you know, to the best of your efforts, they just don't want to stand up straight without a stand. And I do find, unfortunately, that the stands that I've had for many, many years, the sculpted hole on the new era of vintage collection figures is just a little bit smaller, so it doesn't fit the stands that I have for most of my figures. I'm going to have to start tracking down more. So I'm glad that she looks to be fairly steady on her feet, even though I do tend to tweak them because that foot's rolled a little bit. But I'm hoping that means that with her center of gravity and balance, she's going to be able to still hold a pretty good pose with a two-handed accessory in her hand, because that's going to shift her center of gravity a little bit forward. But overall, really nice paint. We can see those nice straight lines there. Everything looks nice and tidy. Just overall, really good. It's exactly what I'm expecting. I think my one little critique about this figure is just the likeness. It's just not, it's like nearly there, pretty close, but just something about it's not, it doesn't look sort of like she stepped off screen in miniature form, like some of my other figures that are just fantastic likeness. But other than that, I think this is a really good likeness and a sort of interpretation of her costume and physique as we see her on screen. I just have to sort of adjust that little ankle part there. But let's get that blaster rifle accessory. So while the Vel Sartha figure is just lying there in the background, let's take a closer look at her one accessory, which is a blaster rifle. So having just recently opened up the Black Series figure, I was curious to see how close the two accessories would be in the two different scales, and there are some interesting differences. So on the Black Series figure accessory, there are two elements that move. The barrel is actually sort of tucked into the main body of the blaster rifle and can be pulled out and extended into the slightly more sort of sniper style mode. On this one, because we're dealing with a much smaller scale, it is fixed. It is sculpted in this long pose here. It can't be moved. Of course, if you wanted to, you could probably edit it down, but that's going to be an irreversible edit there. It is sculpted in this position. This one does have a similar moving part to the Black Series one, which is this sort of folding stock here in the back, but they are sculpted and sort of attached in very different ways. The Black Series one sort of has a rod which is sort of attached through the body at the back end of the blaster rifle. This one, if I try and sort of move it, it comes straight off, and we can see that there isn't a rod. We've just got these sort of two little small pegs on either side of the attachment point, popping that down there. We can see why it is so easy to remove. Instead of it sort of being attached through the main body, we have these little square little peg sort of cutouts there. And of course, squares aren't really the best shape for a rotational movement. As soon as I sort of move it, it wants to pop out because it's not really going to swing around in a square shape, which is kind of interesting, but I do kind of understand why Hasbro would use a square shape. When we click the pieces back into that spot, it keeps it very straight. So it's not really sort of going to flop around a lot. It keeps it in a nice sort of shape there. But of course, if you try and sort of fold it, it's going to look a little bit awkward unless we find that same alignment. And it kind of sits there. It's a little bit awkward. It doesn't really sort of want to sit in the same place that we would sort of have if I try and sort of, it just wants to move around a lot. So I'm just going to pop this down for a minute because of course this part is plain plastic. We don't have too much in the way of surface detail or paint. This one does have a lot of surface detail and paint. It's a lot smaller. It is actually fairly rigid, but we do have a little bit of flex here at the end because it's so thin. Just about any plastic's going to have a little bit of flex when it's this slender. I have to say it's actually pretty straight. Sometimes when you've got these really thin, especially a little bit flat, they can be a little bit bendy. Sometimes they have a little bit of a curve coming straight out of the packaging, but this one's actually nice and straight. And you can see that we actually have a lot of little painted details. They are so small, and you can see that they are lined up pretty well to the actual textured details underneath, which is just fantastic. We've got all of these little silver details here, these ones that look like tiny little buttons. We've got some silver detail here across the top and even right at the end of the barrel there. Fantastic. It's asymmetrical. We have different painted details here on the other side here as well. We also have a bit of a squarish enclosed trigger guard there as well. Really, really nice. Interesting to see that that stock there at the end is different to how it's done on the Black Series one there. So I'm wondering if this is going to be one of those items that's going to be a little bit easier to get into a pose and then try and put this bit on the end here, because I get the feeling that when I'm going to try and put this into a two-handed pose, this is going to be very easy to knock off accidentally because it does come off pretty easily. But as much as I kind of wish it would sort of swing around like the Black Series one, making sure that it stays nice and straight is helpful. So I do understand why they have used a square shape attachment little peg there, but really nice. I love the modern vintage collection accessories. Long ago, you know, we used to have those huge oversized blaster rifles that just looked comical in the hands of their figures, much more accurately scaled and some really fine, fantastic details. So let's go and try and get this into her hands. So sometimes it can be a wrestle, sometimes it goes into their hands pretty well. So let's see which one this one's going to be. Of course, being a smaller female character, she has got very small hands, but sometimes that can work to our advantage. We've got a very small grip here on this accessory, but we've got a nice sized trigger guard and a nice extended finger. We can see that there's a good separation of that trigger finger from the rest of her fingers. This hand, of course, we've got just sort of a classic C grip where she's sort of holding her hand like that, which I'm hoping is going to fit along the bottom edge here because it's quite slender. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, this is going to be an easy one to pose in her hand. So that grip goes into her hand really well. And yes, that finger hooked into the trigger guard really well there. Okay, and that didn't actually knock the stock out of position while I was doing that as well. It just kind of went in. So if we're going to get sort of a one-handed pose, that stock actually fits quite nicely along her arm. I've just kind of got it resting there against her upper arm there. If I'm sort of doing a bit of a one-handed pose, her finger doesn't hook all the way into the trigger guard, but it does actually rest in an appropriate place. I might be able to sort of tweak it there a little bit, but it is hooked in there, and I can see that on the other side there as well. That's quite in there. So we're hoping I don't knock that stock off. Let's see how well I can get her other hand to hold on to this. Oh, that's nice and easy. Okay, so pulling it into that position, it just kind of rotates it just a little bit in her hand, which means that her finger is kind of rotated a little bit away from the trigger guard, but it still looks like it's resting in the right place. But that was actually really easy, just a little bit of a twist there. And because this is a slightly narrower accessory, her hand was already in quite a good sort of cupped shape there. And that fit really well. Of course, it's not quite a natural pose. It's a little bit more of like a presentation pose, like check out my blaster rifle. But it's probably the easiest way to test how well the hands of the figure are going to hold the accessory by just choosing a very sort of easy pose here across the torso. she holds it really well. Of course, I'm probably going to spend a bit of time at maybe trying to get sort of maybe a little bit more of a lower pose there like she has on the backing card, or perhaps I want to sort of get her looking like she's aiming it at an Imperial during the heist on Aldhani. But I'm really happy with how well this is to get the figure to hold it. You know, that's one of my biggest sort of things that I'm looking for. I like my figures to hold, you know, one of their sort of central accessories, and I want it to hold it without too much wrestle. I don't like sort of stressing or sort of feeling like I'm fighting with their figures to get them to hold the accessories that they should be designed to hold. It shouldn't feel awkward or like the hands are sculpted wrong for the accessory that they are packaged with. So I like that she holds this really well. It looks right. It's a good scale to her. And yeah, that's really fun. I thought this little part at the end might go flying when I was trying to get that into her hand, but that was easy. What a relief. And so let's just test out, see how well she's going to balance. So I might need to spend just a little bit of time. Oh, yep, she can stand up. Cool. That's pretty good. She's maybe just, yeah. I've still got to, you know, maybe work on the posing a little bit, but I'm really happy with that. I know she's not, you know, perhaps the most sort of Star Warsy looking character, especially when we take the accessory out of her hands, but she was such a cool character, so central to the show. She was, you know, one of those characters that wasn't just isolated to their particular story arc. We saw her later on in other episodes. She does interweave between a lot of the characters, not just on Aldhani. We see her with Mon Mothma on Coruscant, of course, and I'm really wanting to see more of her in season 2. I thought she was really fun, you know, seeing some of these characters. I know that, you know, a lot of the characters in Andor we don't see in Rogue One, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to meet their fate in season 2. I like to think perhaps they're just on a different mission for the rebellion around the time of Rogue One. I do hope to see more of her in season 2. And I think perhaps I would have liked this figure more if she had a slightly different outfit. You know, when we see them on Aldhani, when we meet that mission team, they have kind of disguised themselves as farmers with some really different looking outfits. I know they're not quite actiony, they're not, you know, holding a lot of weapons in those outfits, they're trying to disguise themselves as farmers. So I do understand why this one was the version of a Vel that Hasbro made first in both figure lines, but I'm hoping to maybe see some other versions of her later down the line as well, because she does have quite a few outfits and she was a really interesting character. And I just want Hasbro to make more figures from Andor, even if it is the same character in a different outfit. Of course, we already have a few versions of Andor, but you know, the series is named after him. Of course, we should have several versions of him already. I really want a Cassian Andor figure in his Narkina 5 Imperial prison outfit. I really want that in my action figure collection alongside a Kino Loy figure. I'm waiting for the day. I know that Deirdre Miro is on the horizon in both the Black Series and Vintage Collection. She is another fantastic standout character. Really wanting more Andor figures from Hasbro. So fingers crossed that Hasbro has some things in the pipeline to release around the release of Andor Season 2, because I'm really looking forward to adding more figures from this fantastic show. And of course, around the hype of that second series would be a fantastic time to release them. So this was a really fun unboxing, a little bit simpler. She doesn't come with a lot of accessories and there wasn't a lot of detail to her costume, but I'm really happy to have her in my collection. It is true to how she appears on the show. I can't ask Hasbro to do more than what appears on screen. So I'm really happy with this figure. Some really cool details, and I'm going to have a lot of fun working her into my display with a cool pose or two. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today as I opened up another Star Wars Vintage Collection figure, checked out all of the details, and had a lot of fun. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the galaxy, and let's hang out again really soon for more Star Wars fun. May the Force be with you. If you're a Vintage Collection fan, I've also opened up the Cassian Andor Aldhani mission figure, VC267. That video's linked here in case you haven't already seen it, as well as a whole Vintage Collection playlist. This is the way.